Hey, folks, welcome. So glad you could join me here tonight. Always a pleasure to engage with all of you, especially at a time when we're facing some very serious events in the world, as we currently are dealing with. We have a very special guest tonight, and I will get to that. But yeah, he's with us, and it's really tremendous. And he's going to be right on. The great journalist, expert on China, filmmaker, speaker, YouTube star, debunker of anti-China propaganda in American media. Coming to us right from China, we have the great Nathan Rich, and he's joining us tonight. It's very exciting. So I guess with no further ado, I will bring on Nathan Rich. Nathan, hello. How are you?
How's it going, everybody? I'm alive.
Yeah. I was really excited about the idea of having you come on this YouTube channel and give your perspective. And you reached out to me, and you are in China, and you are following what Chinese media has to say about this whole crisis in Ukraine. And from what we can all guess, what Chinese media is saying is very different from what American media is saying. So do you want to start out by telling us how people in China are reacting to this?
Sure. So I actually don't really follow too much of the news around here, as a lot of it's in Chinese, obviously, and it's I kind of get their perspective well enough that I don't have to follow it day to day. But the people on the internet that I'm hearing, and the sort of general feeling that I'm getting from the netizens, is that they kind of view the Ukraine as similar to Taiwan. And the reason that they view it this way is because, they say, well, both of these places are sort of backed by the West, or part of this, NATO, or part of this situation where the West is pushing its influence closer to, the homeland, let's just say. And so a lot of people here are happy that there's basically a slap happening on what they essentially consider to be a puppet state. And that's one way to look at it. I kind of disagree with that. And so that's why I wanted to reach out to you, because I've done a lot of research on Chinese history. I consider myself very knowledgeable about, especially the 100 years of humiliation. And everything that I know about Russia, to be honest with you, I've only been to the airport. So what do I actually know about Russia is from my own culture, from my movies and TV shows and all that stuff that I get as an American. And I know the stuff that I learned researching Chinese history. So I just know some very small angles of the Russian experience, mostly revolving around things like 1920s Comintern, the Russia-China relations from the Qing dynasty through about the 1980s, and their attitude towards and with and sometimes against China. So that's kind of why I wanted to reach out to you, because I do watch your videos when I get a chance, and I found you to be, if nothing else, extremely well researched. I don't think even your enemies could argue against that. I mean, you are like a freaking encyclopedia. So I wanted to kind of reach out to you and ask, what am I missing? What am I getting wrong? What am I not aware of? What am I not seeing? Because this is kind of my initial reaction to this war. First of all, I don't think that the Ukraine and Taiwan are similar at all. If anything, I think that DPR and LPR, the states that have formed in Ukraine, I think that those are more similar to Taiwan, because China is recognized as a country. It is a full-blown country, as everyone is aware. And the Ukraine, under the same standards, also is a country, whereas Taiwan is not a country. And the LPR and DPR, even though they have some recognition, they're still not a countries because they're within land that is claimed by a country that is recognized as a country. This is the entire argument disproving Taiwan as a country. So, I mean, what does it really matter if they're countries? Well, for some things, it does matter. But just sticking to the comparison disagreement, if we look at China and Taiwan within it, we can also look at Ukraine and LPR, DPR within it. So from that point of view, Russia saying, okay, you know what? We recognize you as states, we recognize you as countries, and we're going to come in and fight on your behalf and with you and attack basically the rest of Ukraine. To me, that's actually more similar to the United States saying, well, we recognize Taiwan as a country and then invading mainland China from Taiwan. So when I see this whole situation, to me, my initial thoughts are, for now, it's probably good for China because, you know, it takes a lot of focus off of them and heat off of them. And it somewhat strengthens one of their allies, etc. But I think in the longer term, it's setting the precedent of, well, I mean, we can just say that Taiwan's a country and then launch an invasion from there, which I won't say is the U.S. plan, but that is the direction that this propaganda that we've been seeing about Taiwan over the last particularly 10 years seems to be going. I mean, even today, like every day I see some tiny little step towards recognition of Taiwan as a country from, you know, parts of the West. So that's my fear. That's my initial fear. And obviously, I mean, this is the internet, so we actually have to spell things out because people can be such idiots. But I'm against war. I'm against all war. I'm against all killing. I don't even like defensive killing, to be honest with you. I don't even like capital punishment. I really struggle with the idea of causing death. So my initial reaction to this all is I don't like it. And I feel like this is a violation of a country's sovereignty. And wars happen. This kind of thing does happen. It's not necessarily the end of the world, hopefully, but I initially don't support it. Now, I watched a video of yours the other day. I think it was the first one that you made after the war was declared. And I listened to your points. I have to be honest, I haven't been on the internet very much recently, and so I haven't been keeping up. There's some stuff that you said I wasn't really tracking with how you got there, what exactly was going on. You were talking about massacre or you know, all this stuff going on. So I'm coming to you and I'm saying, what am I missing? Why do I have such a apparent disagreement with the Chinese people and the Chinese media about if this is a good or bad thing overall? Where am I lost here? That's my initial position coming to you.
Well, on the first point that you made about how this doesn't compare to Taiwan, you're absolutely right. I mean, Ukraine is a country. Taiwan is not. Taiwan is China. Taiwan has always been China. It's called the Republic of China. It's a Chinese people, right? The only reason they're separate is because of U.S. imperialism and because of, you know, the Civil War and Chiang Kai-shek. And you've laid all that history out very well in your videos. So you're absolutely right about that. Ukraine, I would say, is definitely a country. But where are the borders of Ukraine is a fair question. And that is something that wasn't very clear. And how Ukraine as a country came into being isn't very clear also. And that was kind of the point of Putin's speech that he made. But ultimately, I don't think what's on the table here is whether or not Ukraine is a country. That's not what's going on here. And I agree with you also that war is awful. And, you know, what's happening to people all throughout that region right now is horrendous. People are afraid. People are dying. People are suffering. You know, we just had a conference call for the Center for Political Innovation. One of our members, who's a college student who's from Ukraine, he called in and he talked about how his 65-year-old grandfather or his 65-year-old uncle is being drafted now and conscripted into the Ukrainian military, and just how his family are terrified. And, he obviously doesn't support the U.S. position if he's hanging out with us, but, what he's experiencing is real pain. So we want to acknowledge that. And I don't think anyone's happy about what's going on here. But the reason this is happening is because of the United States. The United States overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014. They installed a fanatically anti-Russian government. And in Ukraine, if you go in the eastern part of the country, a lot of the folks there like Russia. They consider themselves to be Russian. The Communist Party is one of the main parties, along with the Party of Region. You go to the west of countries, people really don't like Russia. And they argue we're more like Europe, and that there is quite a gap. And that there was a government in 2014, Yanukovych, who kind of balanced that, and he was sometimes with the West and sometimes with Russia, and he was in the middle. And that all changed when Barack Obama and Victoria Nuland overthrew the Ukrainian government, and they installed a fanatically anti-Russian government in 2014. They staged a color revolution. And at that point, the people in the eastern region said, well, then we're leaving. And they broke away and they declared independence. They declared the Donetsk People's Republic. They declared the Lugansk People's Republic. And they asked Russia to recognize them at that point. And Russia said no. And they said, we're not going to do that. But Russia was very happy to see that the Minsk Agreement was formed. And in 2015, they got together and they said, we're going to have this agreement to gradually de-escalate tensions, bring these folks back into the Ukrainian government, and that's going to be fine. And then over the course of the last 7 years, the Minsk Agreement has not been fulfilled. Meanwhile, these people in the eastern regions have been facing shelling. And, they have been shelled and bombed. There's been a food blockade. They actually, part of the Minsk Agreement was supposed to be recognizing people's right to speak Russian, if that's their language. In Ukraine now, they're giving people tickets and putting people in jail and giving people tickets for speaking Russian. Part of it was about, making sure that there was access in the media to these people with more of a pro-Russian viewpoint. Well, they've been closing down TV stations and TV networks. There's been people who have been killed. They formed a special division of the Ukrainian military that is ideological, it's called the Azov Battalion, and they kind of model themselves on these Nazi collaborators, this Ukrainian Liberation Army that was formed during World War II to fight against the Soviet Union. They have, they're tearing down the World War II memorials. And these people in the eastern regions, they're being killed. And for 8 years, they've been killed. For 8 years, they've been bombed, they've been shelled, they've been attacked. And the death toll, is 1,300. Some people say it could be as high as 1,600 dead. There's some of the video we're showing on RT right now, there's little girls, showing us the shells, the bombs that have landed in their yard. This has been going on for 8 years. And so finally, it appears that what was happening about a month ago, the United States started this drumbeat. Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And Russia's like, we're not going to invade Ukraine. And they're like, oh, Russia's putting all these troops by the border. And Russia's like, no, we're just having our routine military exercises that we have every year. What in the world's going on? And the USA just would not let this go. Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And it was very, very bizarre. Russia actually started moving their troops away from the border just to accommodate the United States. And then bombs went off in Donetsk. And then all of a sudden, a huge volley of shells started piling into these eastern regions. It was very clear what the United States was doing. It was faking Russia out. So this government, this radical government in Kiev, the USA installed, could go in and attack the eastern regions, and Russia would be afraid to protect them. Well, it didn't work. Russia said, no, you're not going to be able to slaughter these people. We gave you 8 years to recognize these people, 8 years to de-escalate the conflict. We're going to go in and protect them. And on top of that, we are going to take out the Ukrainian military. We are going to just dismantle this Ukrainian military so you can stop terrorizing these people. The way I see that, I think that as awful as it is, not a good situation. I think Russia's right to do that. I don't think Russia has any intention of seizing Ukraine, of occupying Ukraine. They want to dismantle the Ukrainian military so that they can't terrorize them. And they want to make clear that Ukraine cannot join NATO, because right now, the reason this isn't World War III yet is because Ukraine's not part of NATO. If any NATO country gets attacked, immediately all the NATO countries get involved. And so that would mean the USA and Russia having a standoff and nukes going off and we all die. And so when the Ukrainian government in Kiev said that they were going to join NATO, at that point, Putin's like, no, this government, this fanatical government that hates us, that is tearing down the World War II memorials, that's bombing people in the eastern region, they're not joining NATO. There was some talk they might get nuclear weapons. He's like, no, you're not getting nuclear weapons right on the border. And all of that, he said, now we're going to go in, and they're taking apart the Ukrainian military. And they are ready to withdraw, right? All they want is neutrality. If Ukraine will agree to get those lethal U.S. weapons out of there, if Ukraine will agree to not join NATO, Russia will withdraw all its forces. They still will obviously protect the people in the eastern regions, but they have no intention of occupying. They're not going to like make Ukraine part of Russia. And that's the allegation here, is that Putin just wants to restore the Soviet Union or something like that. That's not the case. Now, there are some historical parallels about China that we can get into later. But that's the way I see it. And I think Russia is doing the right thing. And 8 years is a long time. And I just keep thinking, I keep flashing back to, every time Israel bombs Gaza, what do they say? They say, oh, Israel has a right to defend itself. Like, 3 of these Hamas garage rockets will go into Israel, and like 1 or 2 Israelis will die. Israel will just pile into Gaza, kill hundreds, thousands of people. And we're all told, well, hey, Israel has the right to defend itself. That's what mainstream media says. Well, Russia waited 8 years, 13,000 people, maybe even as high as 16,000 people dead. Do they think Russia's just going to let the people in the eastern regions get slaughtered on their border? I think that they have an obligation to protect their allies in Donetsk and Lugansk. And unfortunately, the fall of the Soviet Union really screwed up a lot of things, right? Because this confusion, right? Because this isn't the only place that this is the kind of situation. You got South Ossetia, for example, right? Georgia says they own South Ossetia. Russia says, well, it's an independent country. We recognize it. And do you remember there was something that happened in 2008 when South Ossetia got attacked by Georgia, and then Russia said, well, no, you're not going to attack our friends in South Ossetia. And there was a confrontation. And there's also Transnistria. And the fall of the Soviet Union introduced a lot of confusion, where there was areas that Russia recognizes that NATO and the West doesn't recognize. But I'm happy to see that most of the anti-imperialist, socialist, communist countries around the world are recognizing the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk. Nicaragua recognizes them. Venezuela recognizes them. Cuba recognizes them. Iran recognizes them. The Houthi rebels in Yemen recognize them. A number of countries are stepping up and recognizing the Donetsk People's Republics. So that's kind of my take on it. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's very helpful to see your point of view. There are a few things I would say. First of all, just to get an annoyance out of the way, this really annoys me about the internet, and you brought it up the other day, so I have to mention this. The word invasion is just the most annoying word in the English language, because technically speaking, if you cross a line, right, with intent to do so, and assuming that the other side doesn't want you to, that's an invasion. Mm-hmm. Okay. China can invade Taiwan. But if you say that, then people say, well, no, because then you're saying that they're a country, because that there's these different definitions of this word invade that can get you into a lot of weird, sticky situations where it's almost better to just avoid it altogether. There was a video that I made quite some time ago where I said basically that China didn't invade Vietnam. And I got a lot of people like, what are you talking about? There was this war and the border war and then this and that. They went into Vietnam. And I was like, yeah, but they weren't trying to take over the country. They were just going there on a punitive mission, essentially, because Vietnam had overthrown the Khmer Rouge. Mm-hmm. So I hate this word, because if you use it in one way, like they didn't invade, meaning they didn't go to conquer, then everyone will say, no, they did because they crossed the line. But then if you use it to mean they crossed the line, like, oh, China could invade Taiwan, then everyone says, well, that's not an invasion because it's not a country. It's not. Yeah. So that's just an annoyance. I heard you mention the other day. It's very confusing and annoying. So that's why I'm trying to say words like start the war or declare war, something like that, because the word invasion is really obnoxious. Anyway, that's just a side ramble. Okay. I think that first of all, I'm vaguely aware of the Nazi ideology that or fascist ideology, we can say at the very least, that that Ukraine or Ukraine government or certain parts of Ukraine military, whatever it is, have been accused of. And there's a small point I want to mention there, which is also kind of based on comments from my own channel, which is that there's a lot of people in the world, a lot of people who seem to think that in World War II, the reason that Nazi Germany was, the reason that countries declared war on Nazi Germany was because of the Holocaust or because of the genocide, which is not at all the case. They weren't people, countries didn't declare war on them for being Nazis. That's not what they were being declared war on for. They were being declared war on for because they were expansionists and they were breaking treaties and antagonizing allies and invading, there's that word, invading other countries. So the reason that a lot of these people like to pretend like it was because of the genocide going on is because then they can look at a country like China and say, there's a mosque that got taken down. That's kind of like a destruction of a culture, and culture destruction. That's like a cultural genocide, and cultural genocide, that's a genocide, and genocide, that's kind of like the Holocaust. And they just ramp it up as a justification for war. So I'm rambling, but my point is, being a Nazi or even being a Nazi country or a fascist country, to me, is not necessarily reason enough to launch an attack on that country just because they have a bunch of flags and are highly authoritarian and all the other things that come along with fascism. Obviously, it's not an ideal state, but that alone is not enough. So I'm not really swayed by that, especially because fascism is such a loosely used word these days anyway. It's kind of like, you can throw it at any country. So that I don't really accept as any kind of real substance. But the defensive claim is a bit more persuasive, and I'm going to tell you why. And this is a point that I think is very interesting that Russia did, is before they did anything, they recognized the DPR and LPR as countries. That is an absolute critical first step, because I think even they know you can't just go on behalf of a de facto state, right? You have to be defending a country, a legal country from your country's point of view. And that's kind of been the stopgap between a lot of Western action in China when it comes to Taiwan, because they understand that if they recognize Taiwan as a country, it's basically just instant war with that country. I mean, I assume that China would actually just literally declare war on a country, certain countries, if they said, okay, we're now officially recognizing Taiwan. So it's a stopgap. So I recognize that Russia did that. And as soon as they did that, I thought to myself, well, now they basically have to launch a war, because the only real reason to do that at this particular moment is to say, well, we have to do something, and we can't do something on behalf of a state, right? It needs to be a real country. So the point is, if these types of infractions are happening to a state which you now recognize as an ally country, then you do have the right to fight on behalf of that country. And am I breaking up?
No, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. You do have the right to fight on behalf of that country, and you do have much more of a right to declare war. I recognize that, and this is something that you don't hear on the mainstream media or whatever, is that as soon as they said, we recognize these two states as countries, the second that they say that and sign something, their rights change, their international based rights. Now you actually can go in to do this type of thing to protect your country, sovereign nation allies. And I don't want to get too caught up in the morality of the thing, because the morality of war is very difficult to prove one way or the other, etc. I'm more concerned about is it understandable, or is it something that I strongly disagree with and think is a bad move? I don't have strong feelings about Russia's international politics in the modern era, to be honest with you. I'm mostly, like I said, concerned about their interactions with China in a certain time period. But I was more against it before hearing about this defensive position. This is a lot more interesting. Now, I will say also that in all the news that I'm seeing on this, all the Western media news that I'm reading, I don't see anything about this. I don't see anything about a massacre or a genocide or attacks or anything. I don't see anything about it. So that's can you talk a little bit more about when these were and what the situation is?
Well, and that's the scary thing about it, is that if you turn on the TV in the United States, you would think that Putin is just, having a bad day. And he said, I want Russia to be bigger and I don't like Ukraine existing. So I'm just rolling into Ukraine. And that is not what's going on here at all. And it's important to note that, everything was pretty okay in the country. There was this kind of, agreement where, the people in the East got to do their thing. They got to have the Communist Party represent them and the Party of Regions. The people in the West got to do their thing and, say we feel like we're more like Europe and whatever. And, Russian businesses could operate and American businesses could operate and everyone was happy. And with Crimea, there was a big Russian military base in Crimea, but Crimea was recognized to be part of Ukraine. But they had the big Russian military base there and everyone was fine with it. I mean, until the United States started meddling in Ukraine's politics and overthrew the Ukrainian government, everything was fine. And then, as soon as the Ukrainian government was toppled and they installed this fanatically anti-Russian government, then, of course, all the people in Crimea, this very small peninsula that historically, it was part of Russia until 1956. And that's where it all gets very, very shady, but, it was part of Russia until 1956, until Khrushchev, signed it over to Ukraine. And then all of a sudden, obviously, with this fanatically anti-Russian government, the Russian military base would have to leave. And so all the people who do businesses in Yalta and places like that, and I've been to Crimea, I've seen this, they would all lost their jobs and had to leave. And all the people there who, they're like, well, no. And so they voted to join with Russia. Again, that would never have happened if the way things had been set up at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, where Russia got their base, but, Ukraine got Crimea, everybody was happy with that. And the same with these eastern regions, right? The understanding was, they're part of Ukraine, but they get to speak Russian and, maintain their Russian culture. They get to have the Communist Party and everything was fine. And then Russia held off recognizing them. It didn't just immediately recognize them the second that this fanatical anti-Russian government got in there. It waited 8 years. And I think that what's also interesting, and this is where it gets messy, okay, and that this is a fair point, is that, so what is Ukraine? Somebody super chatted me the other night. They said, how big is Ukraine? And I said, well, that's kind of what the war is about, right? Because, when the Russian Empire existed, there was no clear border of Ukraine. It was just, the Tsar had this big empire and, the people, the Muscovites or whatever were the Russians, right? And then there were Ukrainians that were from this area and there were Belarusians from this area, Moldovans from this area, Well, when the Soviet Union emerged, Lenin was all about the right of self-determination for nations. And so he went around and made a point of, giving these oppressed nationalities their own territory, their own state, their own language, their own written language. That was a big part of what Lenin was about. And at first, Lenin said Ukraine is this big. And then he added part to Ukraine. And then after Lenin, you had Stalin. And then Stalin added to Ukraine. And then you had Khrushchev, who added to Ukraine. Khrushchev added Crimea to Ukraine. And so you go down the line, it's like, so where is the border of Ukraine? And that, I thought it was kind of brilliant when Putin pointed this out in his speech. It's a little bit hypocritical for these Ukrainian ultranationalists to be virulent anti-communists because all the borders of Ukraine were drawn by communists. If the Bolsheviks had not overthrown the Russian Empire and, and created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and a house of nationalities and given every nationality a vote, et cetera, if they'd never done that, there would not be any Ukrainian borders. And so the fact that they're tearing down all the monuments to Lenin and they're decommunizing, decommunization in Ukraine. Well, if you really want to decommunize, then there would be no modern Ukraine, right? And I think that now where you can see a similarity here, and this is fascinating. And I've made this analogy before, and you know way more about this than I do, I'm sure. But I know in China, the feeling that there is one China is very important. The idea there's not a separate Taiwan, there's not a separate Tibet, there's not a separate Uyghur regions, there's not a separate Hong Kong. That is really important, because the way the imperialists kept China poor was by dividing it, was by playing them against each other. And I feel like in Russia, there is a similar feeling that when the Soviet Union was united, even though they had the different nationalities, that's when they industrialized, they raised people out of poverty, they defeated the Nazis, they invented space travel. And that part of the way the United States was able to tear down the Soviet Union was playing up these ethnic and religious differences. And that this isn't just a 20th century thing. This goes throughout the history of Eurasia, right? That, you know, that when there are different tribal groups and different religious groups fighting each other in different regions separate, they're weak. But when they're all together, they're stronger. And that this is a truth about Eurasia in particular. It's a little bit different than the way things work in the West, where we have ocean access and we're seeing things in terms of oceans and global trade and islands and stuff like that. But in this great landmass of Eurasia, having territory together is a key point of unity. And that's why Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Cold War strategist, in his book, The Grand Chessboard, which is about how the United States can dominate Eurasia, he actually wrote that the strategy is to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other, right? Play the different groups against each other so the United States and the West can dominate them. And so the idea, you know, and that was the criticism Putin made of Lenin in his speech, is he said that Lenin was so obsessed with going around to every group in the country and saying, you are a nation, right? You are a nation, you have your own language, you have your own seat in the parliament, you have all of this, that kind of planted the seeds that the United States could then use that and kind of derail it. What do you think of that? Is that kind of a parallel between Russia and China's experience, or no?
Yeah. The thing that's interesting about China's ethnicities and the history of their regions, and something that very few people outside of China understand, is what it actually takes to hold China together is an unimaginable amount of effort. Because even before modern capitalism and merchant capitalism had come around, you do have the inherent human condition problem of different people are going to have, you know, different types of people are going to have a harder time getting along. In China, it's magnified because, of course, the languages are different. They have huge swaths of these different ethnicities and states. Really, in those days, what we would consider to be countries. So Sichuan is basically, at one point in time, was essentially a country. And this is what people don't really understand, is that the definition of country changed over time. And during the early Qing, for example, these were all essentially different countries that were all in the Celestial Empire. And this is why when you talk to like real deal Chinese historians, they use this word Celestial Empire or the empire, but they don't just mean empire. They mean something else, and they can't really figure out how to translate it. What they're trying to tell you is these were all countries. The things that we call provinces now, though they've changed a little bit, but they were countries back then that were all under the flag of China. And this is also why I made a comment a long time ago about how you could sort of argue that parts of Vietnam were actually parts of China at certain points, is because from the Chinese point of view, and in fact, from some of the Vietnamese point of view, there's no difference between Hunan and northern Vietnam. They're just another country in the umbrella of China. And so holding these people together has been extremely, extremely difficult. During the aftermath of the first Opium War, you know, we started to see people falling apart, and the Qing tried to put these mini countries into alignment with each other by putting pressure on the ethnic aspect of things and saying, you know, you might be this kind of Chinese, you might be that kind of Chinese. We're all Chinese. They were really the first modernish empire to try to do that. And in the aftermath of the Second Opium War, saw the Boxer Rebellion, and basically, long story short, by the time the country really fell apart after Yuan Shikai, we had the opposite happening, where now the government didn't really exist, and we sort of started to see what happens to a large portion of the world's population when they're already separated geographically, and that aligns with their ethnicity, which is a huge period of wars. I mean, literally on the order of hundreds of civil wars just inside of Sichuan, literally, like in a very short amount of time, like 30 years. People don't know any of this stuff. And so China just went totally ballistic on itself based on the ethnic, differences of Chinese people. So to hold it together today is absolutely a phenomenal and literally unprecedented thing. And that's one of the things that people miss about the Chinese government.
This is just something I don't know, right? I do know that the Chinese government does consider Tibetans to be a separate nationality. They have like an autonomous region, right? It's part of China, but they are considered to be a national minority, and the same for Uyghurs. Can you talk about why those two groups have this status of being a national minority, whereas Han Chinese is considered the majority, and different regions and different like customs of Han Chinese, that's not considered a national minority? Can you talk about that a little bit? I'm curious about it.
Well, I take issue with your use of the word nationality. I think you mean ethnicity, first of all.
Okay.
But yeah, because you're kind of saying that they have a nation, which is a sovereign state. I think what you mean is kind of their culture plus race, essentially, right? So and that word has different meanings.
It's the Tibet autonomous region, right? It's the Uyghur, it's an autonomous region, whereas most of China, it's just there's different provinces, but they are considered, it's like a territory for this group of people that have some kind of distinction from the rest of China, right? I mean, I'm curious.
Yes, yeah, I got you. So, so one of the first things that happened to me when I came to China is people would come to me and say, we have, I think it's 56 or something. We have 56 ethnicities here. We're so diverse. We have all this diversity. And I thought that was really weird because, people in the West, we just think, oh, Chinese, they're just all Chinese, right? That's just one race. And Japanese, that's one race. And then when you actually go there, they go, no. See that person? That's a different race than me. Like, how do you not see this? We're different. Yeah, we're both Chinese. So there's races in China, and the Chinese people are much more aware of these than we are. In America, we tend to dumb down the races. Essentially, we just kind of go, well, he's black, that's a race now. Oh, he's white, that's a race. Whereas here, they really only have Asian as their race, and so they dissect it and they build a whole taxonomy of it. And so they're much more aware of the nuance and subtleties of the race. Now, the autonomous regions are not based on race, actually, because parts of Sichuan, right, are also Uyghur, right? They're also, Tibetan. That used to be, parts of that used to be called East Tibet, right? If you look at old maps, that was just another part of Tibet. The reason that it's split up is a little bit different, but I just want to finish up on this point, which is that there are different ethnicities all over the country. The fact that aligns with, in some cases, the autonomous regions is mostly coincidental. The reason that Xinjiang and Tibet are their own areas is due to their history, really. They have separate histories, but the basic gist of it is, back when each province was essentially a country, those were the strongest self-governed countries. So if you lived in, Northeast China, you were also in your own little country, essentially, but that country was more directly led by, their version of the central government or the emperor. So, at certain times, Xinjiang and Tibet came in and out of the sort of official rule of Qing, but generally speaking, they were always part of it. And so they usually had local leaders. And the other difference is because of the religious difference, actually. That's really the big difference. It's not an ethnic thing. It's more that the Xinjiang were Muslims, and in Tibet there were Buddhists, and there were a particular kind of Buddhists that wasn't compatible with various waves of religion and non-religion throughout the rest of China. So those two regions is mostly due to religion, because in those days you need your religious leader to lead your miniature country, not some guy who works for the state. And so they were given special recognition and special status because the people there, they're not going to listen to a guy based on the authority of an emperor over somebody with authority of God, essentially, or whatever their deity is. So that's really the origin of how those became. And Xinjiang's a little bit different as well because Russia had a lot of interest in the area and pressured the Qing to make it an autonomous region. They also tried to invade it a couple of times, sort of, and it's a whole complicated thing. But Russia had a lot of interest in that area. They had a somewhat similar view to how they do in their western borders today of this may or may not be part of us. We're kind of ambiguous about this. We're kind of unsure. They're kind of unsure. So the history is very deep, but that's a general concept. Tibet was a little bit different because it's such a highly elevated, difficult to reach place that's already so religious. It's kind of like, well, why are we, let them be the religious thing. And that kind of evolved into, let's not, sort of force them to conform to our ways too much. Let them have some autonomy. And that's kind of my opinion on how those formed. So let me ask you a question though.
Sure.
With this Russia-Ukraine thing, obviously you think that it's justified and it's kind of the lesser of several evils, I'm presuming. So what do you hope to see from Russia for the next step and the next, what do you hope the outcome of this is?
Well, my hope is that the Ukrainian government will say, all right, I guess Russia is serious about this. And we will get rid of our NATO aspirations, and we will get rid of our weapons and our lethal weapons, etc. And Russia will leave us alone, and we'll leave Donetsk and Lugansk alone. And Donetsk and Lugansk can go about their ways. There are many people in Donetsk and Lugansk who want to make those two countries part of the Russian Federation. Not everyone there feels that way, but some of them actually do want to become part of Russia. But they'll understand that, look, you had 8 years to integrate them back into Ukrainian society. You clearly aren't going to do that. So now let them be independent and leave them alone. And Russia would like to, leave Ukraine alone on that basis. And the United States will stop trying to, turn Ukraine into a hostile anti-Russian government. And Russia will be able to not have to worry about these people on their border that are culturally more like them being bombarded and killed. That's my hope of what can come out of this. And I think that that's probably what most people actually in Ukraine want. Now, it's important to note that the Ukrainian diaspora, the people who've left Ukraine, are far more radical and extreme than the people actually in the country. And I know this because I used to live in Cleveland, and in Parma, the suburb of Parma is run by these Ukrainian nationalists, these people who fled Ukraine after the communist revolution. It's like Miami for Cubans, except it's for Ukrainians, right? And that's Parma. And those folks are very radical. They hate Russia. They hate communism. They're like John Birch Society kind of extremists. What's funny is no one was talking about Ukrainian Nazis or Ukraine, Russia stuff, back when I was in college. I was a college student in Cleveland. No one was talking about that, but I knew about it because I was going to college in Cleveland and trying to sell communist newspapers on the street. And I would meet these people and they would say things like, well, communist, that's a plot by the Jews, blah, 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 blah. And if you had a conversation with the Ukrainian nationalist, eventually it got to the Holocaust didn't happen. Eventually it got to, Hitler was a good guy trying to free us from the evil Russians. it was not a surprise to me when I started hearing that a lot of these Ukrainian forces that are fanatical or aligned with the United States. It wasn't a surprise to me because I had heard that. And what bothered me was that, if an average American who wasn't part of like an ethnic group was going around saying things like the Holocaust didn't happen, Hitler wasn't so bad, people would think this guy's a very dangerous extremist. He'd be like completely like, that's not acceptable. But they always got this pass. And people would say, well, they lived under communism. Communism is just so bad, it makes people Nazis. Did you know that, Nathan? Communism is so evil that, people are just allowed to be Nazis. And the USA, I mean, when NATO was formed, they got a lot of ex-Nazis and made them important people in NATO. And that, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in many of these places where they're fighting the Soviet Union, actual Nazis turning up was very common throughout the Cold War. And it's not that different than, a lot of these groups, now I wouldn't call them Nazis because that's a German term, but like the Falun Gong, right? That is an extremist far-right organization that is against the Chinese government, right? They want public executions of homosexuals. They believe that interracial marriage should be outlawed. They think one of the signs that China is falling apart as a country is that women get to vote, God forbid. They're like a far-right extremist group. But on American TV, they just want democracy, and they're just this peaceful exercise club, it's the same kind of thing. And, the Unification Church in South Korea, right? They run the Washington Times newspaper. They're well integrated into U.S. society, but people know this is a fanatical group. They believe this guy, Reverend Moon, was the reincarnation of Jesus sent to earth to unify Christians in a global holy war to destroy communism. And that this, January 6th, the crowd on January 6th, there were a lot of low-income white folks from red states. That's true. But U.S. media did not talk about the fact that crowd was full of Falun Gong people with their epic times, these fanatically anti-Chinese cultists. The Unification Church, Reverend Sun Myung Moon's son, Sean Moon, who like sells firearms for a living, he was in the crowd, on January 6th. He was walking around as a protester. The Miami Cubans that want to overthrow the Cuban government, all the people who fled Cuba and went to Miami, they bust in hundreds of their people. And that around the world, the United States has gone around the world cultivating these fanatics. You can talk about counter gangs. I think that's a word that like British intelligence, Frank Kitson, used to describe, what these groups are. But basically, because communism is an idea that many people will sacrifice and give their life for and become very passionate about, the United States figured, okay, if we're going to defeat these people, we can't just use regular armies and regular governments. We got to build our own kind of fanatics. And those fanatics included Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, who they used to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And they now include the Falun Gong, the Moonies. They include, the Azov Battalion and these fanatical Ukrainian nationalist elements. And that the United States has gone around the world cultivating terrorist and extremist groups to fight countries that they don't like. And these groups have a very different agenda than the overall interest of U.S. imperialism. They want to carry out their short-term goal. Epoch Times doesn't care about how prosperous the United States is as a country. They just want to destroy China. They have a vendetta against the Chinese government. The Miami Cubans, they don't care about the overall interest of America. They just want to destroy the Cuban government. And so Donald Trump kind of built this like rainbow coalition of radical extremists. You had the Pahlaviists, the Shah, the monarchy of Iran. They live in the Shahs of Sunset Park in Southern California. And Trump built this rainbow coalition of all the extremists from around the world the United States has cultivated, and got them together and stormed the Capitol. And then they want to blame it on low-income working people from Alabama and West Virginia. And it's like, why don't we talk about the fact that the U.S. government has this policy of cultivating extremists and fanatics to carry out its goals? And I think that's one thing that you, as someone who's familiar with what's going on in China, and me as somebody who, is following the situation with Russia, I think that's one thing we can agree on, is that this is not a good policy.
Well, yeah, that's a mouthful. There's kind of two overarching points there. One is that the media coverage is exceptionally biased against certain things, and the other is that the U.S. participates in this kind of activity. The interesting thing about the news coverage is I knew that, because we often hear stuff like, oh, North Korea is going to do this and do that, and you kind of go, yeah, well, it just never happens again and again. All this random countries are supposedly about to do something and nothing ever happens. And I knew that this was actually a serious thing because I heard, oh, Russia's threatening to invade Ukraine. And then I looked up all the news hour after hour day after day, I never once saw anything about, oh, here's what Russia's saying. Here's a speech by Putin. Here's his attitude. Here's what they're saying. Like it was just only, here's our description of what they say. Here's what they're going to do. And as soon as you only see one side of the argument about a potential world conflict, you know that something serious is going on. I found that very disturbing, because even when they're going after China, they'll at least throw a line in here or there of like, oh, foreign minister says this or whatever, but they were just kind of saying, well, Russia's going to do this. Intelligence says no reason why, no explanation, no anything. So I think
they were planning to provoke it. That's
biased.
why they were planning to provoke it. I mean, that was the reason, but continue. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's okay. So I agree that the media coverage is so ridiculous, especially when it comes to things like China, especially when it comes, I mean, maybe there's other things, but this is what I focus on, especially when it comes to things like Taiwan, the Republic of China days for mainland. I mean, the whole entire description of the existence of China, why it's there, how it got there, American, what was our role in that? What did we help with? What did we not help with? How do they feel about their history? What actually happened? Literally all of that is so distorted that even people who love China and really want to support it, don't really have any idea what actually happened. And that's because the way that we deal with information today, filtering everything through Wikipedia, which is essentially just run by a bunch of pedantic, agenda-driven imbeciles, it causes this very weird skewing of the world's politics and events, such that if you go and look up something that some overzealous, hyper-progressive columnist really cared about, that's going to have a huge article as if it's some big deal. And then you go and look up an event where, for example, the Kuomintang using chemical weapons against Chinese people in mainland China, just doesn't exist. Never happened. That's not notable, right?
Yeah.
Great
example of that. Great example of that is the Great Leap Forward famine. The Wikipedia page for that is like huge because it has political implications. They blame Mao. They blame the Chinese Communist Party. But there's another famine that happened in the 1920s that killed tens of millions of people. And their Wikipedia page was 3 sentences because it doesn't have political value. They can't blame it on the Chinese Communist Party. When China was dominated by capitalism and there were famines like that all the time and people starved, well, that's not important, right? I mean, I've noticed that with Wikipedia. I mean, it's a really great example of just how biased it is. But continue, please.
Yeah, another good, I was previously holding back a lot of crazy facts that I had found. But recently, I've been really not sure if I'm going to continue doing videos for various reasons. But
that's disappointing. So anyway, we love you. We're huge fans of your work. I mean, I mean that's disappointing. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to be sad to hear that. But your life is your life.
Yeah, it's a complicated reason. Essentially, these videos are. I don't want to get into it. It'll be a whole emotional tirade. But point is, I'm going to be a little bit more open about some of the stuff that I've uncovered. I was really trying not to talk about this stuff because I wanted to kind of wow people and surprise people. But another example of the type of thing that's just doesn't exist is definitive, absolutely, totally proven, verified, backed by U.S. state internal reports, by newspaper reports, by every type of confirmation you can get, that the famine, which was caused by Chiang Kai-shek blowing a dam, which he then blamed on the invading Japanese and said it wasn't him, and then eventually he did admit to. If you go onto Wikipedia or anywhere, and I mean books, historians' accounts, the death count that they give to this event is around 900,000 tops. So what they're saying is that Chiang Kai-shek, the literally fascist inspired, leader of parts of China at that time, most of China, probably, depending on how you look at it. He intentionally blew a dam to push back the Japanese, knowing that it would kill many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people. He warned the people inside of one village about an hour before it happened. And then he set it open. And by some accounts, it actually didn't harm. Here's another thing. When you look it up, they go, and it kind of, stopped the Japanese. So there was some use to it. No, it didn't actually. They just turned to another city, which they weren't going to attack. And then they actually were able to attack it because the city wasn't expecting it, and they were able to sack it. So by some accounts, it actually helped the Japanese. Killed 900,000, according to what everybody is saying. But the actual real reality of that is it's in the millions. And I can absolutely prove it. Absolutely. And I have numerous sources, like I said, including U.S. state reports, all that stuff. And when you look this type of thing up on Wikipedia, it's always the lowest, lightest, most excusable, most understandable, most justifiable description when you're talking about the fascist-inspired government of Taiwan, which happens to be allied with the U.S., at least in spirit. And it's always the worst, most dramatic, most horrifying, most intentional and deliberate and excessive when you're talking about the evil world domination-seeking communists. And it's a real caricature of what communism was at that time, and whatever it is to people today. But when you really look into the truth of what happened throughout China, the distortion by the media today is much worse than it was back then. One small point on this that may blow people's minds as well. If we go by the standards that Wikipedia and therefore many lazy columnists out there go by, there wasn't just one main communist party in China in the early 1920s. There were two. There was the Communist Party of China, the CPC or the CCP. There was them. Everybody knows about that, 1921. But there was another one, and that's called the KMT, or the Kuomintang, led by... Sorry?
Yeah, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, right? It was, yeah.
And here's the thing. I'm not just going by the very close weekly meetings that he had with communist Russia, with their Comintern advisors, with his personal communist advisors. I'm not just going off of that. I'm not just going off of his third principle, which is basically Chinese socialism. I'm not just going based off of that. I'm going based off of the description of the Kuomintang and their policies by Western newspapers. What did we call them? What did we consider them? Bolsheviks, communists, Reds. This is what we called them, because they wanted land reforms and they were against this. They were pushing back to some degree on this capitalism, mindset that the Western countries had brought to China. So before Chiang Kai-shek took over, after Sun Yat-sen died, they were essentially a communist Chinese version of, a slightly different version of communist in China. That was overthrown after Chiang Kai-shek was given a lot of money, by bankers with interest in pushing back the communists. And again, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is not InfoWars shit. I'm talking about New York Times reporting. I'm talking about U.S. State Department documents. I'm talking about real deal, legit research.
Sure. So Dr. Sun Yat-sen and Lenin,
communists. Sorry, go ahead.
Dr. Sun Yat-sen and Lenin were personal friends. And Lenin wouldn't allow the KMT to become a full member of the Communist International, which they wanted, but he allowed them observer status, meaning they attended all the Comintern gatherings. That's widely understood, and that the Soviet Union provided military training to the KMT's army. that they were a pro-Soviet, Soviet-aligned government under Sun Yat-sen. That is widely recognized fact from what I understand. And that right, it was like democracy, independence, and the people's livelihood. That third plank, people's livelihood, meant socialism. It meant some form of socialism. Now, it may not have been Marxist socialism. It may have been, more in lines of Henry George and his idea of taxing land values or something like that. But Dr. Sun Yat-sen was not a capitalist, and he believed in some form of socialism. He didn't, and there's actually a quote from him where it's like, I've read where he says something like, his vision for China is one where the state controls the means of production or something. It's like very blatantly socialist. So I'm with you, absolutely. And I believe Mao Zedong was on the national committee of the KMT at one point. He was like an alternate member of the national committee of the KMT. And the Communist Party was a faction within the KMT. They were considered part of the KMT movement. They were the explicitly Marxist-Leninist faction of KMT. Am I correct?
Yeah, there was various time periods called the United Fronts in which they were together, and the Wampoa Academy opened, I think, in 23, and they were working side by side. I have this beautiful, amazing picture from back then where you've got. I wonder if I can show it. It's just such an amazing, rare. I mean, to me, it's rare, beautiful photo of one of the most prominent communists of the, we later know, working side by side with Chiang Kai-shek at that academy together, working. And it's probably going to be hard for me to find in the moment, but it's Zhou Enlai and Chiang Kai-shek side by side, both super young, working at this academy. And at the time, Chiang Kai-shek went to Russia and he didn't like what he saw. That's another aspect of this, is that Sun Yat-sen was sending these Chinese, soldiers and intelligence people and all these sort of to-be top officials to Russia for training. Chiang Kai-shek hated it, and his opinion was like, these Russians don't know shit about China. They don't know what we're all about. They don't get us. So this is not for us. And so that planted the seed. It kind of backfired when Sun Yat-sen died. And by the way, one of the last things Sun Yat-sen did when he was dying is he wrote a gushing letter to the USSR saying goodbye. I don't know if you know that, but it's very interesting.
I do know his widow became a very strong communist. Madame Sun Yat-sen was a very big supporter of Mao and communism, right? I mean, from what I understand, right?
Yeah. She went on to support the CPC for a very long time, and she was part of the weird split of the sisters, because the other, another one of the sisters was, I guess both of the other sisters were very much aligned with Chiang Kai-shek, one being his wife. And so, wow, that was a long ramble. Anyway, yes, there's a lot more I could say about this, but the coverage, the media coverage about these events is absolutely stupid. And the way that we've now come to depend on this weird Wikipedia, which is extremely politically motivated bunch of morons who are overly pedantic. And I honestly suspect that a lot of people on there have an actual agenda. I don't just mean a personal agenda. Like, they're literally are there for some reason. You know what I'm saying?
Well, Nathan, do you have a Wikipedia page?
I think so. Yeah. I haven't checked in a very long time.
Okay, because I had one for 5 years. I had a Wikipedia page. And then out of the blue, it got taken down. And it was like all on the same day. All these people came on there and they had one argument and why my page should be taken down. They said he's not relevant enough to have a Wikipedia page. And so then people posted my CNN appearances. People posted articles like about my life story that were published in Cleveland. People posted all of this, and they just kept saying, no, this doesn't count. And by all of their criteria, just being an anchor at a reporter at RT, a correspondent, I should have a page by their own criteria. And it was very weird because a lot of people who worked at RT, around the exact same 3 days, their pages went down. And it was very suspicious. It was very, very suspicious. And, I had this page for 5 years. Then all of a sudden, these people just piled on and nope, none of this counts. None of this counts. and it's bizarre. You know, I've been quoted in Forbes magazine. I was like on a ship that went from Iran to Yemen that like created an international incident that like John Kerry was talking about, but nope, this is not relevant. You can't talk about it. It was very suspicious. And then there's a number of people who work in the same field that I do, that do Sputnik radio interviews, that have been to Iran, that have, you know, appear on RT. The same time their pages got taken down. And, you know, there's a woman who calls herself Helen of Destroy. And she has actually written some great articles about Wikipedia's bias. There are certain accounts that do way too much for a person to do, from what I understand. There are certain accounts that are just all over Wikipedia. And yes, there are troll farms editing Wikipedia. You can be sure of that. There have been investigations. I believe Gray Zone and Max Blumenthal have also dug into this as well. Wikipedia is, I mean, at one point it was pretty open, but at this point, it's pretty clear the American government has got its foot in Wikipedia, I think. There's no question about it.
And yeah, that's scary because Wikipedia has become such a filter for what the West thinks is reality. I mean, I remember for a few years, there was a lot of people saying, don't depend on Wikipedia. Don't cite Wikipedia. Don't use Wikipedia for serious research. I don't know if you remember that, but that was a big push for a while. Universities, schools were getting annoyed that everybody was just using Wikipedia. They're like, anybody can edit it, etc. That's just all gone now. Everyone just uses it. I mean, you can catch, if you watch documentaries, especially on YouTube, you see people who cite these facts, and if you actually understand the subject, you may go, that's what some people think, but that's actually not correct. You go look on Wikipedia, and that's the number that they're using. They just literally scan Wikipedia, and that's their source of knowledge. And Chinese netizens I don't think they really understand the power of Wikipedia because of this fact. It's not because Wikipedia says something necessarily. It's because other people will take that as fact, and then they'll produce a documentary based on that. And then other people will believe that because it's a documentary. That's not Wikipedia. That's a research thing. And so it really distorts stuff. I saw a documentary about Unit 731 that was like 5 minutes long, and it literally had like 8 glaring mistakes in it, including suggesting or insinuating the death count numbers as roughly 100 times less than the actual death counts. These types of things, where then you go and look on Wikipedia and you go, oh, that's because whoever happened to edit this article 10 years ago when that part was last changed didn't know what the hell they were talking about. Great. Well, I wonder how much misinformation has been pumped out across the world in the last 10 years based on this number. So the coverage is really horrible. And I'm trying to remember what the second major point was, because we kind of got sidetracked there. You were talking about the media coverage, and then what was the second part, the long part?
You seem to be breaking up a little bit, Nathan. There's been some, you're in and out. Your signal is not always as good. Is there something on your end? Perhaps you had mentioned something. You're breaking up a little bit. You've frozen, I think. Yeah. Are you there?
Give me a second. Why don't you yell at your subscribers for a minute and then take me off while I try to fix this?
Okay, Nathan's going to get his connection fixed there. We do have a couple super chats, and I'm going to ask Nathan the questions. But we have 4 super chat questions that have come in so far. So while Nathan is getting things fixed, we will just kind of go over. We have 4 super chats. Why did communists give so much territory to Ukraine? Do you think a U.S. party calling for a Russia and China alliance would be an alliance with Russia and China would be viable? USA and Canada taking in fighters after this ends, taking in Ukrainian fighters after this ends, and Russia China having the strongest relations in history. So hopefully we will be able to get those questions answered. I think I'm seeing Nathan moving around and stuff. You're back? We're good? You're good?
Let's give it a shot now.
Okay, cool. So you wanted to finish a point that you were making.
Actually, you know what? I found the picture. Let me show you guys this picture if I can figure what I do. Share on this thing.
Okay, you're breaking up all over again. You're breaking up. Yeah, you're breaking up again. So.
All right. Tough stuff. How's it going now? Better?
No, you're totally breaking up. Your screen is frozen, and yeah, you're completely breaking up. Oh, you're back, or
I'm back.
yeah, you're back. You're back.
All right. I can see that I can share my screen. How do I just share like a picture? Can I do that?
I don't know. I've had trouble doing that. You can share video clips, but I've never been able to figure out how to share just an image. I'd like to do
All
that.
right. Well, let me just share the screen then real quick.
All right. Go ahead.
Oh my gosh. Sorry, I just think that this is a picture people should see. It's a really, really interesting picture. Sorry, I'm not used to this. How's this? Oh, here we go.
Okay.
Okay, you see that?
I'm trying to add it to the screen, but it doesn't seem
You can
to
replace it, mute it, or whatever.
Okay. Oh, here we go.
I don't know if you guys can really see this, but this is a very wonderful photo that shows exactly what we're talking about. So this is the Wampoa Military Academy. This is the military academy that was set up by the Kuomintang with the help of the USSR. So these are some of the early troops. And in the foreground here, you have the superintendent at the time. This is Chiang Kai-shek, very young looking Chiang Kai-shek. And this is Zhou Enlai right here.
Wow.
And they're working together. And this is very early. And in my, from what I've been able to find, it's a pretty rare photo. I think it's really a beautiful image because it shows the spirit and the moment. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that with you guys. This is just one of the examples of the type of stuff that I uncover through my research. All right, I'm going to close it now.
Very good. Oh, that was great. That's a great photo. That's a tremendous photo. And, what's kind of amusing is that, we talked about all these like crazy anti-communist groups the USA organizes around the world, like the Azov Battalion, like the Falun Gong Epoch Times that puts out anti-China propaganda, like like all kinds of groups, Tibet separatists, etc. One of the main entities that brought them all together politically was the World Anti-Communist League, which was started by Chiang Kai-shek. It was like a group that Chiang Kai-shek started in Taiwan, that would meet. It was called the World Anti-Communist League. I think that's kind of fascinating. And you can look into their history. It's connected to a lot of death squads in Latin America, like the Contras in Nicaragua, who murdered people and, were the people that brought crack to the United States. They were funded by the World Anti-Communist League. And that's actually why it took Nicaragua so long to recognize China and to withdraw recognition from Taiwan, was because of that. So, because so it's kind of fascinating history there.
That's something you reminded me of what that point is about the way that we do this insurgence and all this kind of stuff. And I just wanted to comment that some of the more fascinating research that I've done is into the origins of the CIA and their early activities. This is another fact that I was going to talk about in Epic China, may still do, is that the CIA essentially originated in China with the OSS. People don't realize that either. This was originally formed as a way to do clandestine operations in China, with the support of the intelligence service, if you want to call it that, of the fascist government in China. And when I say fascist here, I'm not saying like hyperbolically. I mean literally fascist. Like they had their own version of the brown shirts, and they had fascist meetings with daggers, and they were fascists. So the OSS was originally created to combat enemies of this fascist movement in China, and then that later basically dissolved and was replaced in function by the CIA. And when we look at their activities at the time, supporting assassinations, contributing to assassinations and bombings and this kind of stuff, directly supporting miniature opium wars and trying to get opium smuggling to be more profitable for the Kuomintang, this type of thing. It's really something that, many countries do this, but the U.S. has been doing for quite some time, longer than people really realize. It's something that when I take a look at, okay, Trump did this and Biden did that, and I kind of go, yeah, but really this is what the U.S. does. I mean, this is what we do. And this is one of the things that I really don't like about my country's foreign policy, is the way that we have this double standard of going out there and doing a lot of stuff that we would never publicly support, and then condemning any other country who does anything even sort of on the same wavelength as that. I think it's an understandable position when you're the one in power who really wants to stay in power, but it's not something I agree with, and I think that the public could be quite a bit more aware of it. And this ties back into what you're saying about the bias in news media that is so ridiculously over the top at this point that it's a wonder to me that anyone watches the news at all anymore. So yeah, maybe we can go to Super Chats because it's been a while.
All right, very good. Let's start answering Super Chats. So the first, Super Chat is, why did communists give so much territory to Ukraine? That was the first one. So, Nathan, do you want to comment on that? And then I think I can comment on that as well.
I'll leave that to you. I let the experts speak. I don't know anything about Russia-Ukraine relations, honestly.
Well, I mean, as far as the Crimea thing, the fact that Crimea was given to Ukraine, Crimea had never been considered part of Ukraine until 1956. That was some kind of weird backroom deal. Khrushchev was Ukrainian. All right. So that's one thing you have to remember, is that he was ethnically a Ukrainian, right? That's where he was from. And I think there was a feeling that Stalin had been very bad to Ukraine, right? You have to remember, in 1956, Khrushchev came to power, and the first thing he did was just, attack Stalin. At the 20th Party Congress, he gave what was called the secret speech, and he just completely threw Stalin under the bus, said this guy is awful. Everything you heard in mainstream media in the West about Stalin is totally true. Stalin was awful. And then part of the change when Khrushchev came in, or de-Stalinization, was giving Ukraine Crimea. And Khrushchev himself was Ukrainian. And that, by making Crimea part of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, because it didn't really matter, they were all part of the Soviet Union. That'd be like taking a territory from one state in the USA and giving it to another. Didn't matter that much. But because that's such a big military base there, that would mean that Ukraine would get more money, I guess, right? That they would get more of the central government's resources that would have to go to maintain this military base would go, therefore, to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So I think that was Khrushchev was helping out Ukraine, helping out his buddies. It was also probably an anti-Stalin gesture. The idea was Stalin hadn't been so good to Ukraine, so we're going to give Ukraine something. I think that's what it was about. As far as why Stalin added regions to Ukraine, why Lenin did, I don't know. I know there was a lot of fighting in Ukraine during the Russian Civil War in right after the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution was pretty bloodless, right? I mean, it was pretty quick. They just took control in St. Petersburg. But after the Russian Revolution, there was the Russian Civil War. And the Russian Civil War was a disaster. Millions of people died. There was a barricade. They couldn't get food into the country. They couldn't get medicine into the country. 15 different countries invaded. The British sent their armies to Azerbaijan to try and seize the oil fields for the Rothschild oil companies. And the U.S. military, they sent a bunch of guys from Wisconsin to go fight the Bolsheviks. And a lot of them spoke Russian, and a lot of them were in communist labor unions. So some of them actually turned their guns around and joined the Bolsheviks, which is an amazing untold story no one ever talks about. And the Russian Civil War was this awful, awful war in which millions of people died either from starvation. I mean, they had the pogroms that happened. In Ukraine, a lot of these, czarists and supporters of the White Army were just going and slaughtering entire Jewish villages. Sam Marcy, the founder of the Workers' World Party that I was a member of for many years, he was from a Jewish village in Ukraine. And the reason he was a lifelong communist is because when he was like 4 years old, the Red Army rescued his village from the White Army. The White Army were anti-Semites, and they went, and because they considered communism to be somehow Jewish, they would just go into all these villages and just slaughter all the Jews, because they didn't like communists. So because of that ugly Russian civil war, and there was so much fighting in Ukraine during the Russian civil war. The borders of Ukraine got redrawn in, I think, and then Stalin added some territory to it. And, Ukraine is a very important place. Look, I mean, the Soviet Union built the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant. At that point, it was the world's largest. It was the Dnieper Dam. It was in Ukraine. And even up in the 70s, like Donetsk, the Donetsk People's Republic, at one point, the UN actually gave Donetsk an award because they were considered to be like the cleanest city in the world, and in the 1970s. I mean, the Soviet Union did a lot to really build up Ukraine, and Ukraine was a really important part of the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union fell, that devastated Ukraine economically. There were cities in Ukraine during the 1990s that after the Soviet Union fell, they only had electricity for like 3 or 4 hours a day. I mean, it was that bad. I mean, the fall of the Soviet Union devastated Ukraine economically. And that's why you have that polarizing narrative, because the people in the West said, oh, it's the Soviet Union screwed us over and the Soviet Union fell and left us with nothing. The people in the East said, oh, things were better when the Soviet Union was there. The Soviet Union built up Ukraine, and now the Soviet Union's gone, and now we're screwed. And it's kind of a weird interpretation, but basically the 1990s in Ukraine was an absolute disaster. The fall of the Soviet Union devastated Ukraine. The fall of the Soviet Union was bad in Russia. It was really bad in Russia. It was really bad in a lot of countries, but in Ukraine, it was particularly bad. It was a humanitarian crisis. And you talk about the inflow of heroin and sex trafficking. Human trafficking became a really big thing in Ukraine. These women would try to flee, and they'd be told they're going to go to the West and become like a nanny or something, and then they find out they're being human trafficked and sex trafficked in Europe. I mean, it was a disaster. I mean, people talk about the fall of the Soviet Union being economic genocide. So, that's one thing. That's one thing we can talk about. But why don't we go to the next question? Do you think a U.S. party calling for an alliance with Russia and China would be viable? What do you think, Nathan?
No. The short answer is no. We've done so much work to demonize Russia and China in particular over the last 100 years that coming out and trying to weather the opposition for that, I think would just be you would just be avalanched over. I just don't. You have to really start with deprogramming the people who create the media. I think is really how you have to start. If you just go out there and say we should ally with them, they're going to say, but what about this 10 million article long thing going all the way back to 1900? And you have no real way to combat that intellectually. I think you have to really start to change the way that we talk about other countries and really dig into the way that we've at times deliberately misrepresented the past. And really try to undo that quite a bit. We're such a revisionist culture that when you look back at the actual history versus what we all know to be true, you find it's very, very different. And that conveniently forms a very anti-Russia and anti-China platform to stand on.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you, Nathan, because I think that, well, first of all, I'll say that we already have a think tank in the United States that wants to align with Russia and China, and it's called the Center for Political Innovation, the CPI. You can visit our website, CPI USA, and we are looking to get that message that Russia and China are not our enemy. Wall Street is. We want to get that message out there, and we're not a political party. We're a think tank. But I think very much the American people are ready for this because America is falling apart. The roads are unpaved. People are drinking water that's not properly purified. You go to parts of this country, it's just falling apart. The opioid epidemic is destroying people's lives. And so many Midwestern towns, places in Idaho, places in Michigan would kill to have China come and invest and help them build up their infrastructure and help them build it up. And American working class people are ready to fight back. They are tired of what's happening. And I think Donald Trump and Trumpism is an unfortunate attempt to capture some of that anger. But that's a lot of boomers, right? And those folks aren't going to be around forever. but their kids are still going to be facing the same kind of economic situation. The only way the United States is going to get better is if we get rid of the free market, if we align ourselves with Russia and China, and we, start having a government that fights for the people and organizes the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few. If we had a government that stepped in and said, we're going to mobilize the public to rebuild the country's infrastructure, rebuild, new universities and schools, invest in science and education and technological research, nationalize our oil, nationalize our natural gas, have the banking system operated in a way that was for the benefit of the people, guaranteed perhaps an economic bill of rights like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president, that he proposed. If we had a strong government, a government of action, that government would want to align with Russia and China. And in order to do that, they would have to fight Wall Street, because at the end of the day, it is the big corporations, it's the banks, it's the monopolies. They're the ones that hate Russia. They hate Russia because it's an oil and gas competitor. That's what they really don't like. When Russia was dirt poor in the 90s, they loved it. They loved Boris Yeltsin. When Putin got in there, fixed their economy, suddenly they were selling oil and gas on the market in competition. They hated Russia. Same with China. Back when China was the sick man of Asia and starving and poor, the United States really didn't have an issue. But when China lifted itself up and started, pulling itself up with the communist revolution, and now, you go through the course of, Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, and now what China is today, the world's biggest telecommunications manufacturer, every cell phone that Huawei Technologies sells is a cell phone somebody didn't buy from Apple. It's a cell phone somebody didn't buy from, Samsung or Verizon, and that they don't like the fact that Russia and China are competitors. They want to dominate the world market, and they want to push Russia and China off the market. They want the world to be poor, captive markets. And it used to be they had this deal with the devil with the American middle class. It used to be that there was this layer of people in the United States. You can call them like the white middle class, the labor aristocracy, that they would go around the world. They would bomb Vietnam. They would bomb Korea. They would bomb different places. And, this layer of the United States, this middle class, we got houses and cars and TV sets, and we got this comfortable lifestyle because we went along with empire. And that was a deal with the devil. And they've broken that deal. They have canceled middle America. They've said, you're done. Middle America, it was nice. Thank you for fighting our wars. Thank you for waving the flag and supporting our imperialist attacks on other countries. We really appreciate you doing that, but we don't need you anymore now. Now, you're done. You know what I mean? And they're trying to drop the living standards of the United States down to third world levels. And they are trying to basically set up a low-wage police state in the United States and just kind of collapse the U.S. economy into this global, open international system. And now is the time for middle America to rise up and say, you're not going to cancel us. Our enemy is not China. Our enemy is not Russia. Our enemy is not Venezuela or Cuba. Our enemy is Wall Street. Our enemy is the big banks and corporations that are destroying the lives of America's working families. And I think that message really has potential, to resonate with people. Our next conference is going to be in Austin, Texas, March 12th. I'm not just going to be the only one there. Samira Khan, Miss New Jersey 2016 is going to be there. Jackson Hinkle is going to be there. Haas is going to be there. Peter Coffin is going to be there. George Galloway, the TV host from Britain, is making a statement. Tara Reid, the woman who was raped by Joe Biden, is also giving us a video statement. Max Blumenthal is going to be there. And I'm excited. I'm not organizing a political party, but I am getting this message out there that the global imperialist capitalist system is bad for America. And if you're a true patriot, you really love your country, you should want to be friends with China, want to be friends with Russia, and want to put an end to this system and its wars. So that's my perspective, Nathan. So there you go.
So do you think that you would be more viable? Because the question is not should it be done, but would it be viable? Do you think you would be more viable, more appeal to more people if you went out there and said, well, yeah, Russia, they suck, and China, they suck too, but we still should do all these other things except for aligning with them? Do you think that would be more or less viable?
I don't know, because I guess it's like you can't have one without the other. It's like they walk hand in hand. Hating Russia, hating China, that it's like this is what hating Russia and hating China takes the place of doing these things, right? If you talk to the right wing, for example, all the Trump supporters, my allies in Austin, they just went to a Marjorie Taylor Greene event and heard her speak. their narrative is, oh, well, the problem is just that China is taking over the USA. The Democrats are all agents of China, and they're all communists, and we need to privatize everything. We need to have the free market, and we just need to drive out the Democrats that are Chinese agents. And it's even more ridiculous now. The narrative, especially since this war started, the narrative we're getting from the Democrats is, well, the problem is that we have this fascist grouping in the United States, these Trump supporters that are all paid by Russia, and they're all agents of Russia, and we just got to drive them out and everything will be okay. And the way to not talk about fixing the United States and standing up to Wall Street is by diverting the anger against Russia or China. And the Democrats focus on Russia because they're paid by the big oil companies. And the Republicans focus on China because they're the industrial corporations, that My Pillow guy and Mike Lindell and Betsy DeVos, the military contractor. And it's like a division of labor because at the end of the day, they work for the same system. And it's just kind of, they're inciting Americans against each other. The people in the red states are being incited against people in the blue states and vice versa. And they're trying to set up this culture war, so we fight each other and we support government repression against each other while the whole country gets poorer, while they escalate tensions against both Russia and China and Venezuela and Cuba and all the anti-imperialist countries, Iran, etc. So I don't feel like you can really talk about fixing the economy of the United States, fighting Wall Street, without talking about Russia and China being allies. And on top of that, and the icing on the cake, Nathan, is that what they always say, if you ever bring up, having a government that fights for the people and all of that, it came up in every Bernie Sanders interview, is they say, oh, communism never worked anywhere. It just never worked. It always just fails. I mean, we've seen it everywhere. It just fails. And it's like, look at China. At the beginning of the 20th century, China was deeply poor. In 1949, China's deeply poor. Look at China today. That's not communism failing. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of the Communist Party, they industrialized, they defeated the Nazis, they invented space travel. Communism has been a quite successful system. It has problems. In the Soviet Union, they didn't have a market sector and they didn't have market reforms. And when they tried to implement them, they implemented them in a way that tore the country apart. But China, because they've been able to adapt and adjust and cultivate kind of 21st century socialism, they continue to be successful. And Cuba is trying to be more like China. Venezuela and Nicaragua are trying to be more like China. We have to combat the historical narrative that communism has never had any success anywhere. We have to combat that. And part of that means defending Russia and China from these lies. So I don't see fighting for socialism in the United States and challenging, these international narratives of imperialism. I don't see them as separate. I see them as intrinsically tied into each other. You have to do both.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that the way that history is presented to us these days is really building this entire platform for the way that we talk about these countries. And I know what you mean about the right is all, Russians and the left is all Chinese in America somehow. It's a very dishonest and pathetic way to reduce people to non-humans. Basically, you're just saying, no, they're not even a human. They're just a bot for another country, and we don't have to consider their views. Tucker Carlson is constantly called like a Russian puppet and whatever, because he's always saying, forget Russia. We should be, scared about China. We should be attacking China. We should be going after China. He has every right to be that way. But the thing that has really disappointed me most, maybe not most, but really disappointed me about society that I didn't learn until I started making these videos is I didn't really realize how bad the situation is, where everything that you say and do online or in public, like 50% of the people watching you just make these huge, vague assumptions about you that are just ridiculous, and yet they somehow just cling to them. Like they just go, oh, Tucker, oh, he's a Russian agent. How does that work? What are you talking? Like, describe the process to me. It's just this really bizarre notions. Oh, Nathan, he's run by the Chinese government. Oh, really? How come I haven't made a video in 3 months? They fucking run out of money? Like, is that what happened? Like, The conspiracy, like weird ideas that people have are so deranged and bizarre. From my point of view, when I talk to somebody, I assume that that person knows who they are and that they're telling me what they believe. That's my normal status. I don't go to people and say, hey, you know what time it is? And they tell me, and I go, he could be lying to me. Maybe he's an asset. I just go, oh, I guess that's the time. And when I'm talking to Caleb Maupin, I don't think to myself, oh, maybe he's secretly trying to say this. I just go, oh, he's telling me what he thinks, right? This weird thing of dividing everyone into like who's a puppet of what country is totally weird, because I guarantee you, if you sit down with Tucker Carlson in a bar and you get him when he's really particularly open about things, he just believes the things that he's saying. At least very close to them. I don't know why that's so hard for people to come to terms with.
No, I think you're right, and that it's only ever thrown at guys like you and me. And that's, it's only really thrown at people who question U.S. foreign policy narratives. Whereas if you look at the amount of effort to manage mainstream media that goes on, do you think that CNN, the way that they're like crying for Ukraine right now, do you think that's just the reporters? They investigated the case and they just came to that on their own. You think there aren't people handling them? You think when these reporters from the United States go to Ukraine, there's not an effort to make sure they're talking to the right people and they're surrounded with the right people? Anderson Cooper, his first job was with the CIA. He admits that's how he got his job at CNN, was with the CIA. Read about Project Mockingbird. Mainstream media in the United States is not free. And that's the allegation that's constantly thrown at me. I work at RT. Sure, right? RT does receive money from the Russian government. And your point is, right? But it's like, oh, but American media is free. CNN is free. MSNBC is free. Fox is free. It's like, no, US media is very heavily controlled. And on RT, there's a lot more diversity of opinion. At RT, you've got libertarians. At RT, you've got conservatives. You got liberals. You've got, you got leftists. You got Richard Wolff. You got me. You got Lionel, who is a Trump supporter, and you got all kinds of different views. At RT, and on American TV, especially when it comes to anything like Russia and China, it's very narrow. But so I just the attitude, and then no one turns on CNN and goes, oh, that's propaganda. It's just, no, that's just free media. But anything I say because of where I work, or anything you say because you live in China and you put out a point of view that's critical of the American narratives about China, anything we say, it's a way of not, it's like an ad hominem attack, right? Because, like, hypothetically speaking, let's say you were paid by China, right? Or let's say that, that I do work at a Russian company. Does that mean that anything we're saying is false? You could say that in response to anything we say, right? That's not an argument against anything we've ever said, right? It's just a character ad hominem. They're trying to poison the well by saying, well, don't listen to them. Don't listen to them because of this. Whereas that doesn't debunk anything we've ever said. So, that's kind of my attitude toward it.
Yeah, it's keeping in line with the removal of agency from opposition. Essentially, it's a war strategy from ancient times that was based on some weird form of reality. In the ancient days of evolving man, the people over there in that group probably were going to kill you and eat you. So if you said that those people were going to kill and eat you, that's for your own survival. And somehow or another, that's evolved into, well, we need to just dismiss those other people. They're not people like us. There's some reason that everything that they're saying and doing is just already bad. We don't need to actually listen to anybody. And that's why the intellectually impotent people who come to my channel and make these weird accusations are so sad and so pathetic, because they never stop to think, like, if I met a on the street and I say, oh, say one thing, what would the response be? Oh, he would like how a lot of arguments and historical facts, logic, and
you're really breaking up, Nathan. You're really breaking up. I don't know if there's anything you can do about it on your end, but the last 30 seconds or whatever, you're really breaking up. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
I can hear you, buddy.
Yeah, the last 30 seconds. You want to repeat what you said because we missed it all.
Sorry. I was saying that the intellectually flaccid people come to my channel and make accusations about the reason that I have my opinions, which is pretty bizarre. Those people never stop to think about how stupid their theories sound. Like if you met me on the street and you said, "What you say that the Guangdong was essentially communist when they started?" Gotcha, you puppet. I would just say, well, here's all my facts. Here's all my research. I'm just looking into what the actual situation was. Here's the data. Here's my timelines. Does that seem more reasonable to you? Or does it seem like you ask me that and I go, I don't know. Let me go find my script. It's this people live in this bizarre world where I'm the fake one, when in reality, I'm just telling you what my opinion is. Like, why is that so confusing to people? It drives me nuts.
Sure.
Anyway, do we have more super chats?
Yeah, we got 3 more. So one, this is a super chat from Chaya. She's asking, what are the chances of the USA taking in Ukrainian fighters after this is all over? The USA and Canada. And I say, well, that's very high. I mean, that's what always happens. I mean, after the Vietnam War, the USA took in all of the anti-communist folks from Vietnam, and we got Miami Cubans. I think there's a very high chance of that. What do you think, Nathan?
I just think that this whole thing is, sorry, I'm getting just sidetracked by somebody yapping in a group.
Wow.
Sorry. Can you say that again?
Just that, after this conflict is over, what are the chances that then there will be Ukrainian anti-Russian folks taken in by the United States and Canada?
Oh, I think it's very high chance.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the type of thing we love to do. And honestly, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with any country saying, hey, you're in war, come to us. Even if it's for reasons that they're protecting their own clandestine operations, whatever it is. I'm okay with that, honestly. I think that countries should be able to allow people to come from other countries.
Okay. All right. Next question is Russia-China relations are the strongest in history. That's just followed by a question mark. Would you say that's true, Nathan, that they're the strongest in history?
Wow. What an interesting question. Maybe so. Although I will say that Russia and China relations, in my opinion, my view, are not exactly how the Chinese people that I've met and talked to about this, it's not exactly how they see it. It's not exactly how the state media here portrays it. And I don't know how Russia portrays it because I don't know that much about Russia internally. But I would describe Russia-China relations, at least from the Qing dynasty till the 1980s, to be, on average, lukewarm / slightly friendly. I wouldn't really say, oh, they're this great, strong allies the entire time. There were times that they were definitely allies. There were times where they were begrudgingly allied, where they kind of didn't have anybody else but each other. And there were times when Russia did a lot of bad things to China. Nothing on the scale of what a lot of other countries did, but they had concessions in China. They forcibly took land from China. They coerced China when China was weak a few times, and they tried to do some other things that I don't agree with. But and they also, of course, they kind of turned their back on China once the communist revolution had mostly completed. They didn't totally turn their back on them, but they just didn't really commit to like, hey, we're your strong ally now. When Mao went up there, they kind of had a different idea. They were sort of reversing the Comintern ideas, and they had their own political stuff going on. But from China's point of view, they didn't really get the support that they needed. On the other hand, without Russian support defeating Japan, there would be arguably no communist China, or at the very least, it would have taken a lot longer to happen. And there definitely have been times, especially more in modern decades, where Russia really has stood by China and been a pretty good ally. So I would say it's the strongest it's ever been as far as I know, but I would also say that it's not really as strong and supportive as I think a lot of Chinese people assume that it is.
Well, I would argue that, I saw that interview, one of Donald Trump's first interviews when he was running for president with Bill O'Reilly, and he was all like, you can't push Russia and China together. You can't put Russia and China together. And that's what Obama did. He pushed them together. But, that interview, he was hinting at, that when Russia and China divided, that was key in winning the Cold War for the United States. And it was really the Soviet Union's fault. Is the Soviet Union was basically telling Mao that they didn't believe in global communist revolution anymore, and that Mao had to stop aligning with people around the world that were fighting for their national liberation. And then later, after China had been economically cut off and isolated in the world, China, pivoted toward aligning with the United States because the Soviet Union had isolated them and caused them so many problems. But the thing is, now the relationship between Russia and China is not based on ideology. It's not like, oh, we're both communists. They're not communists in the Soviet Union or in Russia anymore. It's a Christian nationalist country. The Communist Party exists. It's a big party, but they're not running the government. The relationship is about economics, that Russia has lots of natural gas and lots of oil. China is an industrial country that is producing huge amounts, but doesn't produce very much of its own oil and gas. And so now they're kind of a match made in heaven. And the more sanctions the USA puts on both countries, the more connected they become. Russia needs to sell their oil and gas. China needs to buy oil and gas to fuel their industrial machine. And they're right next to each other. And the USA hates both of them and continues to sanction and threaten both of them and try to push them off the world market. So I think that, that pulling them apart will be difficult. Now, in Russia, there are people that are critical of China. I mean, I've heard criticism of China in Russia, and I'm sure in China, there are probably people that are very critical of Russia, but the relationship is one of necessity based on economic, kind of a convergence of economic interests. And I think it'll be very hard to pull the two countries apart at this point.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the attitude of people, to what extent that they're allies is not affected by the fact that they are definitely concrete allies for sure. I mean, that's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah. And then the last super chat question we've got is China's success due to them doing more of a market system like Lee Kuan Yew?
Why is China successful? Nathan, go. You got 3 minutes.
Okay.
Well, wow. Okay. China's success is due to the essence of what it's due to is the combination of the strength of the government and the determination of the government to make changes that it has deemed necessary. And when I say the government, I don't necessarily mean this particular government. I mean just in general over the decades. And what I mean by that is in the 30s and the 40s, China was almost just completely dissolved. There was almost nothing left. I have all the statistics and information from all the provinces about the life expectancy, how many people were starving, who was at war, what was happening, what was the life like. I have all that stuff. It was really a miserable situation. The communists had their idea of how to do things, which was the Kuomintang. And then the other communists that are still communist today, the CPC had their idea of how to do things. And America had their idea of what, China should be doing. And then this all kind of came together. Long story short, the Kuomintang's policies failed miserably. They tried to do a lot of things that the Chinese Communist Party got a lot of blame for later. Things like land reforms, things like simplifying the language. Yes, the Kuomintang KMT ROC, the one that constantly pushes this message of our language should never be simplified. Oh, those stupid mainlanders, they simplified it. They tried to simplify the language. And all these types of things. They tried to do a lot of things. They didn't work, basically. This is according to the State Department. And they failed. So then communism was tried, which, their version of communism, which was particularly non-Chinese. Let me just put it that way. It was particularly Russian, with some aspect that Mao had brought into about the peasants. And they tried this way, and it had a large amount of positive effects on China. But when it comes to the economy, it was more about boosting production at that point, because there was no productivity. Everyone was enslaved, dying. It was just, you can't have an economy when you can't do anything. So they went through this phase of trying to build up the productivity and unity of the country. And that, didn't always work. But in the end, the net effect is it ended up working. Mao was a revolutionist, not a politician, in my opinion. And so when he kind of took the lead of the direction of the country, his answer to most big problems was lead through revolution, lead through unity towards a revolution, lead through continued revolution. I mean, this is what the guy was about. And so his answers to questions and problems were different than later politicians' answers. And so when he died and the government was, eventually taken over by various moving parts, but basically when the reform eventually started to happen, people don't understand the circumstances of that time. They don't understand how the Cultural Revolution influenced that, and they're so stupid when they think about China. It's all just so simple to them. But when you look at the circumstances of 1976 and Zhou Enlai dying and Chiang Kai-shek dying and Mao dying and basically a very sort of weak replacement to Mao coming in, and then the implications of that and how it evolved, you start to understand the point of view and the amount of courage, balls that it takes to propose a reform at that time. 1976, 1978, that's like 2 years. To come up with this plan of like, hey, all that stuff that's been going on for the last 30, 40 years that we've been pushing for, let's adjust that in a big way, and let's start to have a market. The courage that it takes to even think to propose that at that time is crazy to me. I was thinking about this the other day. So anyway, the reforms start happening. They don't go very well. In the 80s, it was more decline for China. It was pretty rough. And in my research for the Tiananmen Square 1989 incident, let's just say, in my research for that, I looked at a lot of 1980s information. And one of the most fascinating things to me that zero people outside of China know, I'm sure, is how utterly, completely unpopular the idea was throughout the Chinese people that we're going to open up to markets. They absolutely hated this idea. They hated the idea that they were going to move away from communism. It wasn't the government that hated this. It was the people who hated the idea of moving away from communes and collectiveness into more socialist with, Chinese ideals. They hated this idea. There was protests. They went crazy because people always say, why? Well, think about it. In those days, you always had a job. You always could show up to the factory and you're always welcome and you could always work and you're safe, you're stable, you're secure. You're not going to get fired. Do your job, you're fine. And then someone comes in and says, guys, this warehouse isn't profitable. And they go, yeah, but we need these parts for the city. And they go, yeah, but it's not profitable. So the government's going to stop giving you money and you're just going to go out of business unless you become profitable. Instant strikes, instant protests. Like, what are you? This is crazy. Now you're challenging and attacking my way of life, my stability, my family. It was a horrible experience for them. And so you had this period of time where the Chinese government was sort of in this weird interim where they couldn't quite say that they had achieved what they wanted to with the economic gains, but they couldn't go back at this point. So this is really what the 80s were about. And that led up to the Tiananmen Square incident, in which a lot of people were fighting for democracy in the socialist definition of democracy, which was spun by the media to mean they want to have referendums on everything. And anyway, it's a very complicated thing. But the point is, once China had gone through that period of a good 20 years of very big reforms, is really where it happened. Then, we started to see where it is now. So that's the medium length answer. So the short answer is, the reason that they're so successful is that when Caleb and I were, however old we were in the 1990s, little kids, presumably, doing our little thing, whatever, playing Nintendo, whatever the hell kids do, Chinese people were suffering through this huge change. When we were in the 80s and doing, had big hair, presumably, they were suffering over there through this huge economic change. The answer is they suffered through decades of change to try to form something unique to them that could actually compete with what took America and other countries centuries to form. So they're successful because they suffered through it.
Okay. Well, one thing that I always point out is that I think Deng Xiaoping was brilliant in that he understood a very, 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 very important part of Marxism that gets obscured, and it gets obscured, and that's in the Critique of the Goethe Program, one of Karl Marx's very short pamphlets. He explains that the basis for getting to a society without classes, without inequality, without a government, the basis for that is abundance. It is raising the level of wealth in society. And that you cannot, Marx makes clear, you cannot create an egalitarian or equal society in poverty. And that if you do that, that's not, the results are going to be a disaster. That's Marx makes that point very quickly in like 3 paragraphs in Critique of the Goethe Program. And that got lost during the Cold War. Russia, they had the Russian Revolution, and they were surrounded, and they were a very poor country. And so under Stalin's leadership, they said, we're going to build socialism in one country. And they industrialized, and they had a lot of big achievements. And, Cuba had a revolution, China had a revolution, Vietnam had a revolution. But these countries were all very, very poor. And so a lot of these countries, really after World War II, it really started, that in the Soviet Union, in the final years of Stalin's life, Stalin said, hey, in the Soviet Union, we're already getting toward the early stages of communism. That's ridiculous. They weren't. They were still, they had industrialized, they had raised the country up, but they were nowhere near communism, right? Communism is this, state of, a classless, stateless world. They were nowhere near there. And then Che Guevara, when, the Cuban Revolution happened, Che Guevara said, oh, we don't need material incentives. We're just going to have people work harder because it's for the good of the country. Cuba is still deeply poor, and it caused all kinds of economic problems. Che eventually quit the National Bank and went around, went back to being a military leader because it was a disaster. And then you had the Cultural Revolution in China, which, the Gang of Four said we can achieve a higher stage in poverty. And that was a disaster. And Pol Pot then tried to do what he did in Cambodia, which was a big nightmare. And you cannot build a society in which people are equal and in which all like social hierarchies have broken down when the people are starving, when people are poor, when they don't have a level of development. And that the reason socialism is needed is socialism unleashes the productive forces. By rationally organizing the economy and not having, the chaos of the market in command, you can unleash economic progress to eventually get to that goal. And Deng Xiaoping, when he came forward, it's always quoted in the United States as he said, poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. In the United States, people took that as, oh, he's not really a communist anymore. No, he's a true communist. He's understanding what Karl Marx actually said, which is you cannot build an egalitarian society in poverty. And in order to raise China out of poverty, it was necessary to have market reforms and to allow people to start businesses and to organize. And it's not capitalism in China by any means. The government controls, state-run industries, the government controls banking. They have 5-year economic plans. Even private companies get very carefully controlled by the government. The market is not in control in China. There is a huge market, but the state controls it and forces that market to work on behalf of society. That's socialism. And that China was able to adjust that way, and they were able to have success. And I am really annoyed because frequently people in the United States, when I point out that, you say communism failed everywhere. Well, look at China. China is clearly not a failure. 900 million people lifted out of poverty is not a failure. And people say, oh, well, they're capitalist. Or they'll say, look at China's economy. It got so much better when they implemented market reforms. Well, it was really cold here in my apartment 2 or 3 nights ago. It's February in the United States. So I turned the heater on. I adjusted. So therefore, we should light my bedroom on fire, because that proves more heat is always the answer. I mean, that's the logic of what they're saying. Yes, China needed to adjust their socialist system to have more of a market. That doesn't mean markets are always the answer. That doesn't mean China should therefore try to be like the United States and have unregulated capitalism to the point that, local governments can't even afford to pave their roads anymore. I mean, it doesn't follow. And that I actually... I was on a libertarian podcast a couple weeks ago called Fakertarians. It's these libertarians who kind of go after the attempts by like racists and white supremacists to infiltrate libertarians. And I actually posed to them a question. I said, why do so many libertarians like China? Because China is a country where there is, yes, there is a market. Yes, there is a push for innovation and creativity. But at the same time, there is, huge amounts of government control. The Chinese state is in control. There's no, there's no property rights. There's no government take your hands off. It's not a libertarian country by any means. There is a huge amount of government management of the economy. And we frequently in the United States get this argument that somehow China's success is because they're a free market country. They're clearly not that. There is a big market, but they're not. But one thing, though, that was then pointed out, and this is the only intelligent response I've ever gotten to this argument, is someone pointed out, they said, yes, but there's a big middle class in China. There's a lot of small business owners. There's a lot of people who start their own companies. And that is something that libertarians like. And that's something in the United States that's falling apart. We don't have that anymore. That American middle class is crumbling. And the reason that there is a big middle class in China, from my understanding, is the Chinese Communist Party has worked really hard to create it. They've worked really hard to cultivate it and make that big middle class, right? And they kind of learned the lesson of the fall of the Soviet Union, which is in the Soviet Union, your average people were okay. And the party elite obviously didn't want to bring down communism, but it was your engineers, your college professors, your teachers. Those were the kind of people that felt stifled by that Soviet system. They said, I can do more than this. Doctors. I heard a story about a doctor in Cuba, and he worked really hard. He got his medical degree. He became a doctor, and he got paid like 10 times more what everyone else got paid, but he couldn't do anything with his money because he couldn't, he's going to buy another house? Can't do that. He can't start a business. Can't do that. Can't give anything to anybody else. And so he and his wife would just burn his money for entertainment. Right. It was like, and I've heard stories like that. And that in the Soviet style command economy, that model that Stalin developed, that's very effective in like giving countries that first boost to like build power plants and wipe out illiteracy, that after about a generation, it stagnates because you need people to have creativity. You need people to want to go out and build something. And that oddly, that's what's associated with America, is that, drive, we're going to go create, we're going to go build. And that's very much alive in China. And that's why a lot of market libertarians really like China, is they see that, kind of entrepreneurial American spirit very alive in China. And they identify that with capitalism and libertarianism. And so they like China, but they're kind of missing the overall basis, which is the reason that China has that entrepreneurial spirit is because they have a government that is actively cultivating that. They're not letting the market, just be in command. If the market was just in command of China, you'd have a few monopolies, you'd have everyone getting poorer, you'd have all the problems that plague capitalism. But the Chinese government, by taking control of the economy, has been enabled to kind of cultivate, and enable that growth to continue and kind of overcome, the problems of capitalism and wealth centralizing in the hands of a few, et cetera. So that's my take on it. What do you think of that, Nathan?
Wow. Well, I understand what you were responding to in the first part there, because I said that they had moved away from communism or whatever I said. What I meant there was on the spectrum of communism, the center being, I don't know, whatever is center, and the left being like full-blown living in a commune where everybody's, totally equal. They move closer towards the socialism aspect of it. It's really what I mean. I don't mean necessarily that.
I wasn't responding to you. I was responding to what we widely hear in the United States, what the person
Okay,
who asked
gotcha.
the question may be getting at, which is this is a very
Yeah.
common argument, is that China is proof that capitalism is the answer. And it's just like, that's,
Well,
yeah,
they're always proof. Yeah, every good thing is because of capitalism there, and every bad thing is because those damn commies.
right.
The thing that's interesting about this, I'm very aware of this argument. I hear it a lot from very glibly spoken lines on the right. You know, they just, oh, communism, you know, they always just kind of say one little thing about it. They don't really seem to understand it very well. And I'm not a communist, and I'm not even a socialist. I don't really have a political affiliation personally. I'm not a political person, believe it or not. I tend to just think that countries should have the right to pursue their own way of doing things. But I do understand some things about communism because I study it for Chinese history, something that's very interesting to me. And something that's very fascinating about this argument that they make about, like, oh, it just destroys the quality of life and everything, is because I know their thought process. They're thinking 1960s, 1970s China. Everybody's pushing around a little cart, and we had cars. You know, these guys are like on bicycles if they can even afford one. We got airplanes. We got a jet. These stupid communists, right? And what they're not understanding is, okay, cool. What if you go back to the 1960s and say, hi, person with a bicycle, have you ever seen a bicycle before you got this one? They'll say, no. My father would not even know what a bicycle was, right? That would be the craziest luxury he had ever even imagined. Oh, what about his father? Oh, 3 of his brothers died when they were under the age of 6, and he was enslaved in the military. Oh, okay. Wow. What about his father? Oh, well, he was just an opium addict like his previous 10 generations or whatever, however many generations. And all of them were just enslaved. Oh, okay. Wow. So then when you look at things from that point of view, you go like, wow, they had bicycles? Wow, that's amazing change. Like, because the people I'm reading about, me today, that I'm reading about in the times of the Qing dynasty, and while America is, in the West and all these other, not even just the West, all these countries are making scientific discoveries, and they're turning the telescopes up to the skies, and they're thinking about, all these other planets, right? The people in China, their job is mostly try not to die. That's it. That's their job. Try not to die. And when you go from try not to die to try not to die in a war, which is the after the dissolving of the empire, it's just worse. It's even worse. And so if you can go from even worse to that than that to, well, we have a lot of rules, and there's been a lot of bad shit that's gone on, and we're communists now, and I have a bicycle, and I have a job, and my family's relatively safe, and like we're starting to work together towards something as an actual country rather than just a bunch of little broken up provinces of different people all being conquered by other countries, and we have something that we're fighting for. And maybe I don't even believe in that. Maybe I don't even know what that is. I'm just a farmer. What the hell do I know? But hey, something's happening and we're coming together. If you can achieve that, then in for China in that time period, that's already, as I said very early on in this discussion, keeping those people together, those little miniature countries and this overall country, keeping them together is absolutely the hardest thing I could possibly imagine, living here and seeing how variant all the people are, and how different people are, and how racially different, and their attitudes are different, and just everything's so different. Keeping them together is monumental on its own. So boom, you've got that. Then it's like, okay, well, how can we get it so that only 1 out of every 3 kids will die prematurely rather than the 2 out of 3, right? And then you have people in the West and so on that have had this great wealth that they've made, partially from exploitation of other countries, as we know. They start to turn around and they say these communists have taken over this country, is how they describe it. And then they say 1 out of 3 kids is dying over there. Fucking communists. And you go, yeah, it was 2 out of 3 5 years ago, right? This is the bizarre way that we view only communism, by the way. We don't even do this with Nazism.
No.
I don't know if you realize this. No one ever says that about Nazis. You never look at the Nazi party and go, man, their quality of life sucked. They always go, well, their quality of life was garbage. And then when the Nazis came, it did get a lot better, but right. They always say that, but this and that, and that's why we all hate them. But even like when it comes to communism, they never say that. They always just say, oh, it just made everything much worse. I'm going, well, not in the China I've studied. I don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear that all the time. Communism only made life worse. And that's just not true by any objective measure. Cuba is not worse. Soviet Union was not worse. China is definitely not worse. Vietnam is not worse. I don't know where people get this from. But listen, Nathan, I really appreciate you coming on the channel. I cannot tell you how long I have wanted to have you come on here. Is there anything you want to end with, before we wrap this up? Because it's past 2 a.m. here, and I've got to go to work tomorrow and cover the UN Security Council. And, but it's really, I can't tell you how happy I am to have you on here and how much I love your work. And really, I'm so glad that we have connected. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, just briefly to retouch on the Ukraine-Russia thing as we opened with that and everything. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take your information. I'm going to process it. It does put the Russia point of view a little bit more understandable to me, and I need to kind of think it through. But I really appreciate you talking to me about this and offering your research and your expertise in this area to me. I do watch your channel when I get a chance. And I think that, I may disagree with you on a lot of stuff, but I really appreciate the fact that you're out there and you're fighting the fight and you're fighting for what you believe in. And, you're really a great source of knowledge, especially when it comes to the roots of communism, the goings on about socialism and kind of the history of it and stuff like that, which is particularly fascinating to me. And so, I really appreciate you, buddy. And it was great to have this chat. Thanks everybody for watching. And, talk to you guys later.
All right, great. It was a pleasure. Thanks everybody.
Bye.